In a fold of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ridges catch the morning mist, a handful of log cabins still stand. Here, families have lived for generations, tending plots of vegetables.
The buried truth. Behind the Black Dutch cabins, the Appalachian Mystery Tribe. I spent 31 years as a United States Marshal, tracking fugitives across every terrain this country has to offer, from the concrete canyons of major cities to the frozen wilderness of Alaska to the swamplands of Louisiana, where a man could disappear into the bayou and never be seen again. I thought I understood every way a fugitive could hide, every network that could shelter them, every community that might choose silence over cooperation with federal law enforcement. I was wrong. What I discovered in the mountains along the Tennessee-Virginia-Kentucky border in 2018 was something I had never imagined, something that had been operating for more than 2 centuries, while the rest of America remained completely ignorant of its existence. I'm writing this now because I have been silenced through official channels, because my career was destroyed when I tried to expose what I found, and because somewhere in those mountains right now, there are men and women who have committed terrible crimes living out their lives in peace, protected by a community that has made sanctuary for fugitives its primary purpose for more than 200 years. My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal James Dalton, retired. I say retired because that is the official terminology, but forced out would be more accurate. I was 57 years old in 2018, assigned to the Eastern Tennessee District Office in Knoxville, and I had a reputation as someone who never gave up on a case, who would track a fugitive for years if necessary, who took personal offense when someone thought they could escape justice by running. My closure rate was among the highest in the service, and I had brought in fugitives from every state in the Union and half a dozen foreign countries. When the case that would end my career landed on my desk in March of 2018, I thought it would be another routine manhunt, difficult perhaps, but ultimately solvable through the same combination of persistence, investigation, and luck that had served me throughout my career. I did not understand that I was about to encounter a system specifically designed to defeat people like me, a system that had been perfecting its methods since before the United States existed as a nation. The fugitive's name was Marcus Wayne Hendricks, and he was wanted for a double homicide in Nashville. He had killed his wife and her lover in a rage that witnesses described as almost supernatural in its violence, then had vanished before police could respond to the 911 call from a neighbor who had heard the screaming. Hendricks was 43 years old, a construction contractor with no prior criminal record, a man who by all accounts had lived a quiet life until something snapped inside him and he became a murderer. The case was straightforward in its essentials. We knew who had committed the crime, we had physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, and we had every reason to believe that Hendricks would be caught quickly because he had no experience evading law enforcement and no known connections to criminal networks that might shelter him. We were wrong about that last part. We were catastrophically wrong. Hendricks disappeared completely after leaving the murder scene. His vehicle was found abandoned at a truck stop in Cookeville, suggesting that he had switched to another mode of transportation, but no witness could be found who had seen him there or who could identify what vehicle he might have entered. His bank accounts went untouched. His credit cards were never used. His phone went dead and never reactivated. Every lead we developed went cold within days. The man had simply ceased to exist, vanishing as completely as if he had stepped through a door into another dimension. This pattern was familiar to experienced marshals. It suggested that Hendricks had accessed some kind of support network, someone or something that had helped him disappear. Our job was to identify that network and follow it to wherever Hendricks was hiding. The break came 6 months into the investigation, through an informant who had connections to criminal networks throughout the Appalachian region. The informant, whose identity I still cannot reveal for his own protection, told me that he had heard rumors about Hendricks, that the fugitive had gone to ground in a place where law enforcement could not follow, a community in the mountains that had been sheltering people for generations. He called them the Black Dutch, a name I recognized from my knowledge of Appalachian folklore, but had never associated with fugitive networks. The Black Dutch were supposedly a mystery people, a community of uncertain ethnic origin who had lived in the mountains since before reliable records existed. They were known to be isolated, suspicious of outsiders, and resistant to any form of government intrusion. What my informant told me suggested they were something more, a sanctuary that had been accepting fugitives for over 200 years, absorbing them into their community and protecting them from anyone who came looking. I was skeptical at first. The idea that an entire community could operate as a fugitive haven for 2 centuries without law enforcement, becoming aware of it, seemed implausible, the kind of conspiracy theory that informants sometimes offered when they had nothing more concrete to provide. But the informant was insistent, and he provided details that suggested genuine knowledge rather than rumor. He described a system by which fugitives could make contact with the Black Dutch, a series of intermediaries who would evaluate potential refugees and arrange transport to the community for those who were accepted. He described the terms of sanctuary: complete absorption into the community, marriage to local families, abandonment of all previous identity, and absolute loyalty to the network that had saved them. He described the genetic diversity of the community, which he attributed not to ancient mystery, but to centuries of absorbing people from every background who had needed to disappear. And he described the location, a series of hollows along the border where Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky meet, accessible only by roads that were not marked on any official map. I began investigating with the caution that the informant's warnings had inspired. I researched the Black Dutch through historical records, genealogical databases, and the fragmentary academic literature that had attempted to explain their origins. What I found was a mystery that had puzzled researchers for generations, a community that claimed European ancestry but displayed physical characteristics that suggested Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, or even African heritage, a community that had resisted every attempt to determine their true origins through census records, oral histories, or genetic testing. The conventional explanations ranged from shipwrecked sailors to Portuguese Jews to Native American admixture, but none of them fully accounted for the diversity I saw in the photographs I was able to locate. The informant's explanation that the diversity came from centuries of absorbing fugitives from every background was at least as plausible as any alternative I had encountered. I approached the investigation slowly, aware that any premature move might alert the community and cause them to relocate Hendricks or implement whatever protocols they had developed for dealing with law enforcement attention. I identified the region where the Black Dutch settlements were concentrated, studied the terrain through satellite imagery and topographic maps, and interviewed local residents who might have knowledge of the community. What I learned confirmed the informant's account in disturbing ways. The Black Dutch were real, they were isolated, and they were known to the surrounding population as people who kept to themselves and who did not welcome outsiders. There were rumors about what happened in their hollows, stories that ranged from the implausible to the horrifying, but the common thread was that people who went into those hollows, uninvited, sometimes did not come out. I made my first attempt to enter Black Dutch territory in September of 2018, approximately 6 months after beginning my investigation. I went alone against protocol because I believed that a single marshal would be less threatening than a team, and because I wanted to conduct a reconnaissance before committing additional resources. The approach required driving for more than an hour on roads that deteriorated from paved to gravel to dirt, before finally becoming little more than tracks through the forest. The terrain was steep and heavily wooded, providing natural concealment for anyone who wanted to observe approaching vehicles without being seen themselves. By the time I reached the first settlement, I was certain that my arrival had been noted and reported to whoever coordinated security for the community. The settlement itself was smaller than I had expected, perhaps a dozen structures arranged along a narrow valley floor with a stream running through the center. The buildings were a mix of old and new, from log cabins that might have been standing for 2 centuries to modern prefabricated structures with satellite dishes and solar panels. People watched me from porches and windows as I drove slowly through the settlement, their faces showing the mixed features that had puzzled researchers for generations. Some looked Mediterranean, others could have passed for Native American, still others displayed characteristics that suggested African or Middle Eastern ancestry. What they shared was the expression with which they regarded me, not hostility exactly, but a wariness that suggested they had seen people like me before and knew exactly how to handle us. I stopped at what appeared to be a general store, a building with a wide porch where several men sat in chairs that might not have moved in decades. I introduced myself as a federal marshal, showed my credentials, and explained that I was looking for a fugitive who might have passed through the area. The men listened without visible reaction. Then one of them, an elderly man with skin the color of old bronze and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me, spoke for the group. He told me that no strangers had come to the settlement, that the community kept to itself and did not involve itself in the affairs of the outside world, and that I was welcome to look around if I wished, but would find nothing of interest. His tone was polite but final, the voice of someone who had delivered this message many times before, and who knew that it would be accepted, because the alternative was more trouble than any visitor wanted. I did look around, walking through the settlement with the eyes of someone trained to notice things that did not belong. I saw nothing that definitively proved the informant's claims, but I also saw things that were difficult to explain otherwise. I saw people whose features suggested they had not been born in Appalachia, people whose bearing and manner indicated backgrounds very different from subsistence farming in the mountains. I saw vehicles with license plates from distant states, vehicles that seemed too new and too expensive for a community that appeared to survive on small-scale agriculture and logging. I saw buildings that were locked and guarded, buildings that the residents steered me away from with explanations about storage and privacy that did not quite ring true. I left the settlement after approximately 2 hours, convinced that the informant had been telling the truth, but lacking any evidence that would justify a larger operation. Over the following weeks, I continued my investigation from a distance, using surveillance techniques that would not alert the community to my ongoing interest. I documented the vehicles that came and went from the hollows, noting the patterns that might indicate fugitive movement. I researched the license plates I had photographed, finding that many were registered to individuals who had no apparent connection to the region and whose backgrounds suggested possible criminal involvement. I interviewed people in surrounding communities, carefully probing for information about the Black Dutch while avoiding any suggestion that I suspected them of harboring fugitives. What I learned built a picture of a network far larger and far older than I had initially imagined. The Black Dutch had been operating as a sanctuary since the late 1700s, according to the oral histories I was able to collect from elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told. The community had originally formed from diverse elements: escaped indentured servants, mixed-race individuals fleeing discriminatory laws, religious dissenters who had run afoul of colonial authorities, and criminals who had escaped justice in the coastal settlements. These founding elements had established a tradition of providing refuge to others in similar circumstances, a tradition that had evolved over 2 centuries into something approaching a formal institution. The community had developed protocols for evaluating potential refugees, for transporting them safely to the hollows, for integrating them into the local population, and for protecting them from anyone who came looking. These protocols had been refined through generations of experience, creating a system that had successfully evaded detection for longer than the United States had existed as a nation. The diversity of the community, I now understood, was not a mystery to be solved through genetic analysis. It was evidence of the community's true function. The Black Dutch looked different from their Scots-Irish and English neighbors because they were different, because their ancestors had come from everywhere: slaves who had killed their masters and fled north, soldiers who had deserted their units, businessmen who had embezzled and disappeared, murderers and thieves and fraudsters from every era of American history. They had come seeking sanctuary, and they had found it. They had married into the local families, raised children who carried their diverse genetics, and created a population that defied easy categorization precisely because it was the product of 2 centuries of absorbing America's fugitives. I was piecing together this history when the community became aware of the depth of my investigation. I do not know exactly how they learned what I was doing, whether through informants in law enforcement, through surveillance of my activities, or through the simple accumulation of reports from people I had interviewed. What I know is that they decided I had become a threat that required direct action. They came for me on a night in late October, 3 men who intercepted me on one of the back roads I had been using for surveillance. They were professional in their approach, blocking my vehicle with their own, approaching with weapons drawn, giving instructions that left no room for resistance. They bound me, hooded me, and transported me to a location that I could not see, but that I knew from the duration of the drive must be deep within Black Dutch territory. I spent what I later calculated to be approximately 5 weeks in their custody, held in an underground facility that had clearly been designed and used for this purpose for a very long time. The walls were stone, reinforced with modern concrete, and the cells where I was kept showed the wear of generations of occupancy. I was not alone in that facility. There were others, men and women who had threatened the community in various ways and who had been detained until the leadership could determine how to handle them. Some had been there for weeks, others for months, and at least one man had been held for more than 3 years while his case worked its way through whatever process the community used to make such decisions. We were fed adequately, treated without gratuitous cruelty, and given to understand that our fates depended entirely on the community's assessment of the threats we posed and the options available for neutralizing those threats. During my captivity, I was interrogated repeatedly by men who wanted to know exactly what I had learned, who I had told, and what evidence existed outside my personal knowledge. I told them the truth, partly because I had no reason to protect information that might secure my release, and partly because I suspected they would know if I lied. They were experienced at this, I realized, practiced in the art of extracting information from people who had reason to conceal it. The interrogations were not violent, but they were thorough, conducted with a patience that suggested the interrogators had all the time in the world and were confident of eventually learning everything I knew. Between interrogations, I was educated about the community and its history by a man who introduced himself as Elder Samuel Trent, a title that suggested his position in the community's leadership structure. Trent was perhaps 70 years old, with features that combined elements I associated with Native American, Mediterranean, and African ancestry, a living embodiment of the community's diverse heritage. He spoke about the Black Dutch with pride, describing their history as a tradition of resistance to unjust authority, a continuation of practices that dated back to the earliest human communities. He explained the philosophy that justified their work, that justice was a human construction, often corrupt and frequently wrong, and that providing sanctuary to those fleeing its persecution was a moral obligation rather than a crime. He spoke of famous fugitives who had found refuge with the Black Dutch, names I recognized from history books, men and women who had supposedly disappeared forever, but who had actually lived out their lives in these hollows, protected by a community that asked only loyalty in return. I learned during these conversations that Marcus Wayne Hendricks was indeed in the community, had been absorbed into it within weeks of his crime, and was already building a new life under a new identity. He had married a local woman, was working as a carpenter, and would eventually have children who would carry his genes into the next generation of Black Dutch. The community did not care that he had murdered 2 people. They cared only that he had committed to their way of life, and that he would protect their secrets as they protected him. This was the bargain that had sustained the community for more than 2 centuries. Absolute sanctuary in exchange for absolute loyalty, a deal that transformed fugitives into community members and that ensured their silence through bonds of mutual complicity and genuine belonging. I also learned about the network that made this system possible. The Black Dutch had developed relationships with criminal organizations, corrupt officials, and professional facilitators throughout the country who could identify potential refugees and guide them to safety. These relationships were carefully managed, limited to people who had proven their reliability over years or even generations of cooperation. The network could move a fugitive from almost anywhere in the country to the Black Dutch hollows within days, providing transportation, documentation, and cover stories that would withstand casual scrutiny. The fees for this service were substantial, but the community offered payment plans for those who could not afford the full amount up front, collecting the balance through labor or through shares of whatever legitimate income the refugee might earn after absorption. The system was businesslike, efficient, and had processed hundreds of fugitives over the decades without a single exposure. My release came in early December, after the community had apparently concluded that I could be managed through means other than permanent detention. I was transported out of the hollows while blindfolded, released on a rural road miles from any settlement, and warned that any attempt to continue my investigation would result in consequences far more severe than what I had already experienced. The warning was delivered without drama, a simple statement of fact from men who clearly had the capability and the will to carry it out. I was given my credentials and my weapon, both of which had been taken during my capture, and left to find my way back to civilization. I reported my experience through official channels, providing every detail I could remember about the community, its location, its operations, and the fugitives I knew to be sheltered there. The response was not what I expected. My supervisors listened to my account with expressions I could not read, asked clarifying questions that seemed designed to identify inconsistencies rather than to gather actionable intelligence, and ultimately concluded that my experience had left me traumatized and that my account could not be verified sufficiently to justify the kind of operation I was requesting. The investigation I had been conducting was closed. My recommendation for a multi-agency task force was denied. My request for reassignment to continue pursuing the case independently was refused. Within 6 months of my release, I had been placed on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation, and the evaluation had concluded that I was no longer fit for field duty. Retirement was presented as the only alternative to a medical discharge that would have been far more damaging to my record and my pension. I understood what had happened, even if I could not prove it. The Black Dutch had relationships with people in positions of authority, relationships that had been cultivated over generations and that could be activated when necessary to protect the community. Someone in the chain of command that had reviewed my report had decided that pursuing the investigation was not in their interest, and that decision had flowed down through bureaucratic channels until it reached me in the form of a career-ending medical evaluation. I was not the first law enforcement officer to encounter the Black Dutch, I realized, and I was not the first to be neutralized through institutional mechanisms rather than direct violence. The community had survived for more than 2 centuries by understanding how power worked and by developing relationships that could be leveraged when necessary. My investigation had been dangerous, not because I had learned too much, but because I had been willing to act on what I learned. And that willingness had made me a threat that required elimination. I have spent the years since my forced retirement trying to find someone who would believe me, trying to gather evidence that would force an investigation despite the institutional resistance I had encountered. I have contacted journalists, congressional staffers, advocacy organizations, anyone who might have the resources and the independence to pursue what I could not. The response has been uniform: initial interest followed by a conclusion that my claims are too extraordinary to pursue without corroborating evidence that I cannot provide. The Black Dutch have been protecting themselves for more than 200 years, and they have become very good at it. Every avenue of exposure has been anticipated and blocked. Every potential investigator has been identified and neutralized. Every institutional pathway has been corrupted or confused to the point where action is impossible. But I am still trying. I am writing this account because I believe that documentation matters, that the truth has value even when it cannot produce immediate action, that future investigators may succeed where I have failed if they have access to the information I have assembled. Marcus Wayne Hendricks is still living in those hollows, protected by a community that considers his murders irrelevant to his value as a member. Hundreds of other fugitives, some guilty of crimes far worse than his, are living the same protected existence. Their victims denied any possibility of justice, their crimes erased by a system that has been perfecting the art of disappearance for longer than our nation has existed. The Black Dutch are real. The Sanctuary Network is real. The fugitives are real. And somewhere in those mountains right now, another murderer or rapist or fraud is being absorbed into a community that will protect them forever, provided only that they commit to the life they are offered and maintain the silence on which everything depends. I cannot stop this. I have tried for years, and I have failed. But maybe you can succeed where I failed. Maybe this account will reach someone with the resources and the determination to finally expose what has been hidden for more than 2 centuries. My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal James Dalton, retired. I spent 5 weeks as a captive of the Black Dutch Fugitive Network. I discovered a system that has been defying American justice since before there was American justice. I escaped, but I could not bring the network down. The rest is up to you. Please do not let the fugitives win. Please do not let the victims be forgotten. Please do something. Please. Before I conclude this account, I want to share specific details that might help an investigator succeed where I failed. During my captivity, I learned information about the network's operations that I have not previously disclosed because I feared retaliation against myself and my family. But I have decided that the potential benefit of disclosure outweighs the personal risk, and that whoever pursues this truth will need every advantage I can provide. The network's intake process operates through a series of regional coordinators who identify potential refugees and evaluate their suitability for absorption into the community. These coordinators are not Black Dutch themselves, but rather individuals who have developed relationships with the community over years of cooperation. They include criminal defense attorneys, who recognize when clients are facing certain conviction, bail bondsmen who identify defendants likely to flee, and professional fixers who operate in the criminal underworld of major cities. When a potential refugee is identified, the coordinator makes contact with the community through secure channels and provides information about the individual's background, the charges they face, and their ability to pay for sanctuary. The community evaluates each case based on criteria that include the refugee's potential value as a community member, the risk that accepting them would bring unwanted attention, and the financial terms that can be negotiated. Transportation to the Black Dutch Hollows is arranged through a network of safe houses and trusted drivers who move refugees in stages, never allowing any single person to know the complete route from origin to destination. The journey typically takes between 3 and 7 days, depending on distance and the level of heat surrounding the fugitive's case. Refugees are provided with temporary documentation during transit and are coached on the cover stories they will use if questioned. Upon arrival in the Hollows, they enter an orientation period, during which they are evaluated more thoroughly and introduced to the community's expectations. Those who pass this evaluation are assigned to families who will sponsor their integration, providing housing, employment, and eventually marriage partners who will cement their connection to the community through blood. The financial structure of the network is sophisticated enough to handle substantial sums without attracting regulatory attention. Fees are typically paid in cash, delivered through the same intermediary network that arranges transportation. For fugitives who cannot pay the full amount up front, the community offers terms that allow payment over time through labor or through shares of legitimate income earned after integration. Some fugitives arrive with substantial assets that they have managed to conceal or transfer before fleeing, and these assets are laundered through community-controlled businesses before being integrated into the local economy. The total annual revenue of the network, based on my estimates of the number of fugitives processed and the fees charged, likely exceeds several $1 million. The Black Dutch settlements themselves are distributed across several hollows in the border region, with the main concentration in an area that straddles the Tennessee-Virginia line. The community maintains several types of facilities: residential areas where integrated members live ordinary lives, secure facilities where new arrivals are processed and where threats are detained, and hidden locations where particularly sensitive operations are conducted. The underground facility where I was held is one of several such facilities that the community has developed over generations, providing secure detention capability that rivals anything operated by law enforcement. The integration of fugitives into the community is remarkably thorough. Within a few years of arrival, most refugees have married local partners, fathered or born children, and established themselves in community economic life. They adopt local customs, learn local dialect patterns, and develop the network of relationships that binds the community together. Their previous identities are systematically erased, with any documentation destroyed and any digital footprints eliminated through the network's technical capabilities. By the time a decade has passed, most refugees are indistinguishable from born community members, their fugitive origins known only to the leadership that manages the sanctuary system. The community's security capabilities are substantial and have been developed over centuries of experience with threats both internal and external. They maintain surveillance on the approaches to their territory, monitor law enforcement communications through both technical means and human sources, and have developed protocols for responding to various threat scenarios. When I was captured, the operation was executed with a professionalism that suggested extensive training and experience. The community has had to defend itself against threats ranging from bounty hunters to federal marshals to organized crime figures seeking to extract refugees who had fled with money or information. They have prevailed against all of these threats through a combination of vigilance, capability, and the strategic patience that comes from operating on a generational timescale. If these details help anyone pursue the truth about the Black Dutch, my captivity and my destroyed career will have served some purpose. If they do not, if this account is dismissed like everything else I have tried, then at least I will know that I did everything within my power to expose what I discovered. The Mystery Tribe is not a mystery. It is a sanctuary for people who have escaped justice, a refuge for the guilty, a system that has been defeating law enforcement for more than 200 years. Marcus Wayne Hendricks killed 2 people and will never face trial. Hundreds of others like him are living protected lives in those hollows. Their victims have been denied justice. Their crimes have been erased. My name is James Dalton. I could not bring them to justice, but maybe you can. Please try. Please. There are additional aspects of my experience that I have been reluctant to share because they involve ongoing cases and individuals who might face consequences if their connection to my investigation were revealed. But I have decided that completeness is more important than caution at this point, and that anyone who investigates the Black Dutch will need to understand the full scope of what they are facing. During my captivity, I was shown evidence of fugitives who had been absorbed into the community over the decades, evidence that was presented to demonstrate the scope and success of the sanctuary operation. I saw photographs of men and women who had been among America's most wanted, criminals whose faces had appeared on post office walls and FBI bulletins, living ordinary lives in the Black Dutch hollows years or decades after their supposed disappearances. I saw documentation of the identities they had assumed, the families they had joined, the children they had raised. I saw the proof that the system worked exactly as advertised, transforming fugitives into community members so completely that their previous existence was effectively erased. Some of the faces I recognized. There was a man who had been wanted for a series of armored car robberies in the 1990s, crimes that had left 3 guards dead and more than $4 million missing. He had been living in the hollows for more than 20 years, had married twice, had fathered 5 children, and was now a respected elder in the community whose violent past was known only to the leadership that had accepted him. There was a woman who had been wanted for her role in a domestic terrorism conspiracy in the early 2000s, a bomb plot that had killed 7 people at a federal building. She had been absorbed into the community within weeks of the attack, had raised a family, and was now a grandmother who taught Sunday school at one of the community's churches. There were drug traffickers and embezzlers and murderers of every description, all living peacefully in a community that asked only loyalty and silence in return for perpetual protection. The scope of what I witnessed suggested that the Black Dutch had processed hundreds of fugitives over the generations, possibly thousands. Not all of them had been violent criminals. Some had been white-collar offenders fleeing fraud charges, people who had stolen from employers or defrauded investors, and who faced decades in federal prison if captured. Some had been political fugitives, activists who had crossed lines during the tumultuous decades of the 20th century and who had found that the causes they served could not protect them from prosecution. Some had been ordinary people who had made terrible mistakes, killed spouses in moments of rage or caused deaths through negligence, and who had chosen flight over the certainty of conviction. The community accepted them all, provided they could pay the fees and commit to the life that was offered. I was particularly struck by the generational nature of the community's fugitive heritage. Many of the current residents were not themselves fugitives, but rather the descendants of fugitives who had been absorbed generations ago. They had grown up knowing the true history of their families, understanding that their grandparents or great-grandparents had arrived as criminals fleeing justice and had been transformed into community members through the sanctuary system. This knowledge bound them to the community's mission with a loyalty that was almost religious in its intensity. They were not just protecting current fugitives. They were honoring the memory of ancestors who had found salvation in the hollows and who had built the lives that their descendants now enjoyed. The children of the community were raised with a particular worldview that emphasized the injustice of mainstream American society and the moral righteousness of providing sanctuary to those it persecuted. They were taught that the legal system was corrupt, that prisons were instruments of oppression, that the people who came to the community seeking refuge were victims rather than criminals, regardless of what they had done. This education began early and continued throughout childhood, creating adults who were utterly committed to the community's mission and who would never consider betraying its secrets. The indoctrination was thorough enough that I encountered younger community members who seemed genuinely unable to understand why someone might object to harboring murderers and rapists. They had been raised to see such objections as evidence of the corruption they had been taught to despise. I want to describe some specific cases that I learned about during my captivity, cases that demonstrate the scope and longevity of the sanctuary operation. I will change certain details to protect sources who might face retaliation. But the essential facts are accurate based on what I was shown and told. In 1987, a man named Theodore Marsh was wanted for the murder of his business partner in Cincinnati. The killing had been brutal, committed with a hammer during an argument about money, and Marsh had fled before police arrived. He made contact with the Black Dutch Network through a defense attorney who had represented him on an earlier, unrelated matter, and he was transported to the Hollows within a week of the murder. He was assigned to a family, given work in the community's logging operation, and eventually married a local woman who bore him 3 children. He lived in the community for 31 years before dying of natural causes in 2018, just a few months before my own arrival. He was buried in the community cemetery under the name he had been given upon absorption, and his victim's family never learned what had happened to the man who had killed their son and brother. In 1994, a woman named Catherine Vance was wanted for embezzling more than $3 million from the investment firm, where she worked as a senior accountant. She had been systematically looting client accounts for years, using the money to fund a lifestyle that included multiple properties, luxury vehicles, and extensive travel. When the scheme was discovered, she was tipped off by a colleague and fled before charges could be filed. She arrived in the Black Dutch community with approximately $200,000 in cash, which she used to pay for sanctuary and to establish herself in the community's economy. She was eventually integrated into the administrative functions of the sanctuary network itself, using her financial expertise to help manage the considerable sums that flowed through the system. She was still living in the community when I was held there, a respected figure whose criminal past was an open secret among those who knew. In 2003, a man named David Torrance was wanted for the murder of his estranged wife and her parents in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The killings had been methodical rather than impulsive, suggesting premeditation that would have resulted in first-degree murder charges and likely a death sentence if he had been captured in that state. He contacted the Black Dutch Network through intermediaries in the criminal underworld of Pittsburgh, paid a substantial fee from money he had hidden before the killings, and was absorbed into the community within 2 weeks of the crime. He was given a new identity, assigned to a family, and put to work in one of the community's legitimate businesses. He had been living in the Hollows for 15 years when I arrived, had remarried, and had 2 children who knew nothing about the family he had destroyed before their births. These cases represent only a fraction of what I learned during my captivity, a sampling that barely suggests the true scope of the sanctuary operation. The Black Dutch have been absorbing fugitives for more than 200 years, processing new arrivals every year, building a community whose population includes a significant percentage of people who are technically wanted by law enforcement somewhere in America. The integration is so complete that many of these individuals have effectively ceased to be fugitives in any meaningful sense. They have new identities, new families, new lives that have continued for years or decades without interruption. They will never be found because they no longer exist in any form that law enforcement could recognize. The implications of what I discovered extend far beyond the specific cases I witnessed. The Black Dutch network represents a fundamental challenge to the concept of justice itself. Every fugitive who finds sanctuary there is a case that will never be closed, a victim who will never receive vindication, a crime that will never be punished. The families of murder victims will never know what happened to the people who killed their loved ones. The survivors of assault and abuse will never see their attackers face consequences. The investors and employees who were defrauded will never recover what was stolen. Justice, in any meaningful sense, has been permanently defeated for every case that has passed through the Black Dutch system, and the system continues. Right now, as I write these words, there are fugitives somewhere in America who are making contact with the network's intermediaries, negotiating the terms of their sanctuary, preparing to be transported to the hollows where they will disappear forever. Some of them are guilty of terrible crimes, the kinds of offenses that would result in life sentences or execution if they were ever brought to trial. Others are guilty of lesser offenses, crimes that might have resulted in years rather than decades of imprisonment. The community does not distinguish. It accepts anyone who can pay and who is willing to commit to the life that is offered. The only criterion that matters is the fugitive's ability to become a loyal member of the community and to maintain the silence on which everything depends. I have thought often about the moral framework that sustains this system. The Black Dutch believe they are doing something righteous, providing sanctuary to people who are fleeing persecution by an unjust system. They point to cases where the legal system has indeed been unjust, where innocent people have been convicted, and where guilty people have been punished disproportionately. They argue that their sanctuary has protected people who deserved protection, even if it has also protected people who did not. They see themselves as standing outside a corrupt system, providing an alternative that serves a higher justice than the courts and prisons of mainstream America. I reject this framework completely. The legal system is imperfect, sometimes terribly so, but it is the only mechanism we have for holding people accountable for the harm they cause to others. The Black Dutch have not created an alternative to injustice. They have created impunity for anyone with enough money and enough willingness to abandon their previous life. They have made it possible for murderers to escape consequences, for rapists to live in peace, for fraudsters to enjoy the proceeds of their crimes. They have constructed a system that benefits the guilty at the expense of the innocent, that privileges escape over accountability, that treats the suffering of victims as irrelevant to the moral calculations that determine who deserves sanctuary. This is what I want anyone who reads this account to understand. The Black Dutch are not romantic outlaws providing refuge to the persecuted. They are enablers of the worst crimes imaginable, profiting from the desperation of people who have harmed others and who want to escape the consequences of that harm. They have been doing this for more than 200 years, and they will continue doing it until someone finds a way to stop them. I could not be that person. I tried and I failed, and I have paid a terrible price for my failure. But I believe that the truth matters, even when it cannot produce immediate action, that documentation has value, even when the systems that should respond to it have been corrupted or paralyzed. This account is my contribution to a future that I may not live to see, a future in which the Black Dutch have been exposed and their sanctuary system has been dismantled. My name is James Dalton. I was a United States Marshal. I discovered a network that has been defeating American justice since before America existed. I could not bring the network down, but the truth is here now, recorded in words that cannot be erased. Maybe someone will read these words and find a way to do what I could not. Maybe justice will finally come to the hollows where the guilty have hidden for so long. Maybe the victims will finally be remembered and the fugitives will finally be found. That is my hope. That is all I have left. Please do not let me hope in vain. Please.